My name is Sergeant Rick Schiff. I'm an 11-year veteran of the San Francisco Police Department. I hold the department's highest Medal of Honor for bravery. That used to mean a lot more to me than it does now. What I'd like to talk to you about today is my now 7-year-old daughter. This is an identical twin. Her sister is now dead. Her sister, when she was 4 years old, Kristen, developed a highly malignant brain tumor that had spread throughout her spine and her brain. The doctors told us that we had really two options: take her home, let her die, or bring her in for massive dosages of chemo and radiation simultaneously. In either event, she was going to die. They were quite certain of that, and very quickly. Believing her only chance to be the standard route, we gave her the chemo and radiation. It burned her skull so bad she had second-degree burns and her hair never came back. To change her diapers, we had to wear rubber gloves because her urine was so toxic and it burned her. At the end of 6 months, miraculously, she survived the standard treatment, although there was a high expectation she wouldn't. She still had cancer. We were told, sorry, we've done everything we can. Now she's going to die, probably within a couple of months. My wife and I, choosing not to accept that, started reading. The first book I picked up, the 3rd chapter, discussed Dr. Burzynski. As you may guess, I have some expertise in fraud. In fact, I'm quite certain there are enough attorneys in the room that I could be vordeered as an expert in fraud. And I conducted my own investigation. I have no doubt the man is not a fraud. I have no doubt that he does what he does out of earnest belief that his medicine works. And now you're in a position to judge for yourselves whether it works or not, but it's well established by the FDA that it's non-toxic. 18 months later, we took my daughter off the anti-neoplastin. She had not died. She had no signs of tumor. She remained free for 18 months of cancer. Within a month, the cancer was widespread in her brain. We put her back on Burzynski's. By the way, at the objections of our doctors, for some reason felt that it had failed her. We put her back on. Within 9 weeks, the tumor was completely gone. She died last July of neurological necrosis. Her brain fell apart from the radiation. The autopsy showed that she was completely cancer-free. Out of 52 cases of that disease ever, no one died cancer-free, just Chrissy. So she didn't die of a terminal illness. She died of my inability to care for her properly, and she died from bad advice. She died because there's a government institution that disseminates false information and is not looking out for the welfare of the people. You know, ladies and gentlemen, I swore an oath 11 years ago, and I think most of us in this room swore it at one time or another, to uphold the Constitution. It says life right in the beginning.
I first heard of Dr. Burzynski back in the late 1980s when he was in a battle with the Texas Medical Board and the FDA regarding his innovative approach to cancer. I wasn't surprised by that. Anyone who's innovative in medicine creates waves in the medical system. However, in his case, I was continually surprised that they didn't put him out of business. I kept hearing about him. So in the mid-1990s, I said, Dr. Burzynski, I want to come down to visit your clinic and find out what you're doing. It's very new to me. When I arrived, he had 7 charts ready for me to review that had been reviewed by the National Cancer Institute, who also made a site visit the year before. The National Cancer Institute reported that these 7 patients were either in complete remission or there was substantial improvement. I was astounded. Dr. Burzynski had MRIs of brain tumors known to be almost universally fatal that had simply disappeared. It was obvious to me that Dr. Burzynski had made the most important discovery in cancer treatment ever. It's what we have been looking for.
A Polish native named Stanislaw Burzynski attended Lublin Medical University, where he graduated first in his class at age 24, and then received his PhD in biochemistry the following year. While undergoing his research to acquire his PhD, Dr. Burzynski made a profound discovery. He found a strain of peptides in human blood and urine that had never before been recorded in biomedical research. As his curiosity in these peptides evolved, he made another profound observation. People who were inflicted with cancer seemed to lack these newly discovered peptides in both their blood and urine, while those who were healthy and free of cancer appeared to have an abundance of these peptides. Dr. Burzynski theorized that if he could somehow provide a way to chemically extract these peptides from the blood and urine of healthy donors and administer these peptides to those with cancer, perhaps it could be useful in treating the disease.
Now, discovering something in the urine at that time that had not been discovered before is like finding a whole bunch of islands 10 miles off the coast of Miami. It came as a big surprise. All of a sudden, he was besmirched as the urine doctor. We forget that extracting things from the urine is an established medical modality. Tens of millions of women have been swallowing extracts of horse urine, Premarin, for decades. But all of a sudden, it was abhorrent to our sensitivities. Well, Dr. Burzynski now synthesizes all of the antineoplastons.
Dr. Burzynski's manufacturing facility in Stafford, Texas, where his antineoplastons are now synthesized, is a multi-million-dollar, 46,000 square foot facility which staffs 5 engineers, 4 chemists, 3 pharmacists, 4 medical doctors, and 4 researchers.
When we started in 1970s, now is forming a completely new approach to cancer treatment, which is called gene-targeted therapy. Antineoplastons are medicines which work on the genes which are causing cancer. And now there's 25 medications which belong to the family of gene-targeted therapy, which are approved by FDA in the United States. The problem with these medicines is that they don't cover as many genes as antineoplastons. Many of them simply work on single genes, and this is not enough to have long-term responses. Single medicine is not going to do it. It's not enough. Antineoplastons work on close to 100 different genes.
Our bodies contain 2 categories of genes that allow cancer to flourish: oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes. When someone has cancer, they have a higher level of oncogenes switched on, with a higher level of tumor suppressor genes switched off. The goal is to tell the body to both switch back on the tumor suppressor genes and turn off as many oncogenes as possible.
Statistically, every day, 1 out of 10,000 cells in our body may develop in the wrong way, and some of these cells may become cancerous cells. But why we don't develop cancer, all of us, is because we have protective system, we have antineoplastons who will immediately force these malignant cells to die by working on the genes, by turning on genes which fight cancer, turning off the genes which promote cancer. As long as we have proper amount of antineoplastons in our system, we should not develop cancer. If we are deficient, then we can develop cancer. So this means that I put together a theory of the second quote-unquote immune system in our body.
Today, Dr. Burzynski is permitted by the FDA to treat cancer patients using antineoplastons in FDA-approved clinical trials. Since brain cancer is one of the most difficult types of cancer to treat, he places a heavy focus on brain cancer in his clinical trials.
On May 15th of 2000, I was diagnosed with an inoperable stage 3 anaplastic astrocytoma brain tumor. Following my diagnosis, I was told that I had 6 to 18 months to live. So I met with oncologists here in Los Angeles and in San Francisco, and they were telling me at that time, the oncologist told me that the protocol for me would be to do Temodar, which is a chemotherapy, followed by a course of radiation. I asked them what that treatment would get me, and they said maybe 5 years. Maybe 5 years of life. So of course I asked what would happen after 5 years if I get to that 5 years, and they said, well, we'll see what's available at that time, meaning I would perpetually be on a course of treatment. Didn't sound good enough for me. Also at that time I'd heard about Dr. Burzynski in Houston, and I found out about Dr. Burzynski through a friend of mine, but I met with a prominent neurosurgeon here who wrote off Dr. Burzynski. I mean, he told me point blank that antineoplastons don't work. Dr. Burzynski's treatment really sounded right to me. So I started on his treatment on June 6th of 2000. And in December of 2000, all that was left of the tumor was scar tissue. And again, this was confirmed through an MRI. In October of 2001, I stopped anti-neoplastin therapy altogether. I've had annual MRIs since that time, so over the course of the last 8 years, annual MRIs have confirmed all that's left of the tumor is scar tissue, and I've been off of treatment for that entire time. So Dr. Burzynski cured me of a brain tumor.
If we review Jody Fenton's medical records, who was known at this time as Jody Gold before she was married in 2005, it shows she underwent an MRI at St. John's Medical Center in Los Angeles on May 11th of 2000, where they found a 2-centimeter mass which they suspected was cancer. The pathology department at St. John's performed a biopsy 4 days later and confirmed that she did indeed have a malignant brain tumor. Ordinarily, the FDA requires that anyone who wishes to be a part of Dr. Burzynski's trials must first have already undergone chemotherapy and radiation and failed. However, since Jody's tumor was so aggressive and her prognosis severely grim, she managed to get special exception status to be placed into this trial without undergoing any other prior treatment whatsoever. An MRI on June 1st of 2000 revealed the size of the enhancing portion of Jody's tumor, which was the part of her tumor that was the most aggressively growing. On June 6th, she started anti-neoplastin treatment, and by July 3rd, only a month after starting treatment, the enhancing portion of her tumor was gone. Her tumor remained non-existent up until September of the following year, when she stopped her anti-neoplastin treatment altogether. It's one thing to be shown a single anecdotal case with this type of brain tumor, and it's another to simply compare clinical trial data of inoperable anaplastic astrocytoma patients treated with toxic radiation and chemotherapy versus clinical trial data using only Dr. Burzynski's non-toxic anti-neoplastin therapy. A 2005 clinical trial report using only radiation and chemotherapy found that 5 of 54 patients, or 9%, were cancer-free at the end of treatment, while a 2008 clinical trial report using only anti-neoplastons found that 5 of 20 patients, or 25%, were cancer-free at the end of treatment, with no toxic side effects. Jody Fenton is one of them.
If Jody Fenton had undergone the therapies originally prescribed to her, her life would have been very different. Now she is alive, well, and prospering. It's as if she had a bacterial infection and Dr. Burzynski treated it with antibiotics.
4 years after my diagnosis, I had run into one of the neuro-oncologists that I met with and told him that I had gone to Dr. Burzynski and I was cured, and he kind of wrote it off. I was very excited to tell him that I was cured, and he really burst my bubble about it, so it was somewhat depressing for me. Another doctor that I have, when I told him I had an anaplastic astrocytoma, he was very excited. He's like, bleep, 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 I can't believe this is you, because do you know what the prognosis for this is? And I said, yes. And he's like, I can't believe you survived this, and he was very excited for me.
Now, if you're ever going to go into cancer treatment, you do not want to go into childhood brain tumors, because childhood brain tumors, by and large, are 100% fatal. This would be the worst class of cancers to treat. But he began getting enormous success.
Arguably the worst type of cancer is inoperable brainstem glioma. Usually it involves brain of children, and unfortunately there's very little what can be done. Radiation is the only treatment which can be used to slow down the progress. So that's the type of tumor for which there's no curative treatment, no chemotherapy which is approved. And numerous clinical trials were performed but failed in the past. So we selected this type of tumor because we would like to prove the point beyond any doubt that this type of cancer can be cured by the use of anti-neoplastons. And we already have proof that it can be cured.
She was diagnosed in March of '96. She was 11 and pretty much just started having really bad double vision is how we discovered it. Went to the eye doctor, and that's when they did the MRI and discovered it was a brainstem glioma. And they explained that hers was diffuse, where it was like the healthy tissue and the cancerous tissue were swirled together. So of course surgery wasn't an option. And with the radiation they suggested, her prognosis was probably going to be about 8 to 18 months.
The thing is, with the radiation, what it would do to you, from what I understood, was they would shoot the beam through your ears, and the beam would burn your healthy and your cancerous cells inside or outside in. So all your hair around your ears would be gone, never grow back. Your ears would become deformed and burnt. You would become deaf because you couldn't hear. It would also destroy your pituitary gland, which is the gland that helps you grow as you hit puberty.
Yeah, she was 11 at the time, and that was a real concern I had.
And it'd make you stay in an 11-year-old body. And basically, in the end, you'd become in a vegetated state where you couldn't take care of yourself, which wasn't a very good quality of life.
Because my big concern was with the oncologist originally that we were dealing with was, you know, how it was going to affect her development, and when she started to enter the teenage years, starting a period and growing and developing. And he just looked at me and he said, well, frankly, Mrs. Russell, she's not going to live that long.
What she would have to go through in those extra months, that would be horrible. I wouldn't want to go through it. Why do it?
You're handed the death sentence anyway. So what was the point of the radiation?
You know, you have to say, okay, modern medicine doesn't have an answer. Let's find our own.
Jessica Russell's brainstem glioma was confirmed by an MRI in Springfield, Missouri, and the Children's Hospital of St. Louis, Missouri.
Jessie Russell is riding on the best news she's had since March. She and her parents now believe they are on their way to a cure for what doctors had said was an incurable brain tumor. Here at the Burzynski Clinic in Houston, Texas, the Russells have found an experimental drug they could only dream of 8 months ago. That's when Jessie was still a 5th grader at a Catholic elementary school in Springfield. It's when one of her eyes started crossing in. She started seeing double. It's when Jessie went to the doctor and learned she had one of the most aggressive kinds of brain cancer. A malignant tumor doctors said would kill her within months, and that radiation would only give her a little more time.
And I would live for only 3 months and live in pain, and that's it, and not a fun life. Yeah, I would still die.
Today, the medical pictures tell a different story. You can see the improvement immediately just looking at Jessie's eyes now compared to last May.
An MRI on May 7th of 1996 revealed the size of the enhancing portion of Jessica's tumor. 1 month into starting anti-neoplaston treatment, her tumor disappeared. However, given the aggressive nature of this type of tumor, it quickly returned in August and remained until November, in which time Dr. Burzynski doubled her anti-neoplaston dosage until her tumor went away in December, only to return again in January of 1997, stayed around until April, and finally disappeared in May of 1997, 1 year after starting anti-neoplaston treatment. Jessica's tumor remained non-existent up until October 2001, when her brainstem glioma was considered resolved.
There were very few doctors that you would tell them you were seeing Burzynski that would be kind of encouraging and positive with you. Most of them, they would hear the name Burzynski and they wouldn't want to deal with you because they were afraid. I'm so relieved that we found Dr. Burzynski's. Literally, it did save her life. And here she is now 24, and she's got a little boy who's almost 5, and then she has her second baby will be born in October. We just found out she's having a little girl.
Again, it's one thing to observe a single anecdotal childhood brainstem glioma survivor, and it's another to see the results from FDA-supervised clinical trials treating Jessica's type of cancer. Here is a table illustrating studies published in 2006 comparing the results of different childhood brainstem glioma treatments. There were 3 groups treated with radiation and chemotherapy, and 2 groups treated with Dr. Burzynski's anti-neoplastons. Out of all 3 groups treated with radiation and chemotherapy, only 1 of 107 patients, or 0.9%, were cancer-free after treatment. However, this patient did not live beyond 5 years, presumably being devastated by the amount of radiation and chemotherapy. Out of both groups treated with anti-neoplastons, 11 of the 40 patients, or 27.5%, were cancer-free after treatment, and 11 of the 40 patients, or 27.5%, lived more than 5 years. Most of these brainstem glioma survivors who were not previously subjected to toxic chemotherapy and radiation before starting anti-neoplaston treatment have gone on to enjoy full, healthy lives.
So the good news is that the cancer can be cured. The worst type of cancer can be cured, for good. The people who are surviving, they live normal life. No side effects from the treatment, no symptoms, no sign of tumors, back to life. We studied some of them as children, and they have their own 3 children. There is no impairment of fertility. They just live normal life. The bad thing, however, is that we know that we can help not everybody, but some of these patients. Well, if about 30% of patients can survive over 5 years, and a number of them live over 10 years without any sign of cancer, that's a good thing. But obviously this is just the beginning. We need to perfect this. We need to introduce the newer generation of angioplastons, which we call 2nd and the 3rd generation angioplastons, to make the treatment more effective, to cover broad spectrum, and to be easier to administer.
They came back, they said she has this large baseball-sized tumor in her abdomen, and not only that, but it's in her kidney. It was like everywhere. It was like
and her liver and her lungs.
Her kidney and her lungs. So here we are thinking, basically, this child has literally a few months to live, is basically what they told us. At that point, they said, well, we think we can get the original tumor out. So they had this surgeon. He was able to go in. He got the whole tumor. She did lose her left kidney and her left adrenal gland. And it was 4 drugs. And it was like 8 pages of side effects and very little hope that it would even work. So because the drugs were minotaine, doxorubicin, etoposide, and cisplatin. And they told us, admittedly, this is the most toxic regimen that we have. We have a 6-month-old with 1 kidney, and the side effects were like kidney failure, hearing failure, leukemia, I mean other kinds of cancers coming from this. And I was just like, even if she's going to pass away, I can't do this to her. I can't, because it's like, why would I want her last few months of life to be miserable?
I didn't know what to do. I just knew that I didn't want to put her through all that intense high-dose chemo and miss out on what might be the last bit of time that we have with her, because I had talked to my uncle. He's in his 60s now, but when in 1969, my cousin, his daughter, was like 3, and she got cancer of some kind. And he told me about what that was like in that time, and they just kept giving her more chemo and more chemo and more chemo, and then finally we had this long, several-hour conversation one day, and he told me, I asked him, because I had prepared myself, was trying to prepare myself, I said, what is it like when a doctor tells you, that's it, I can't do anymore? And my uncle Ray told me that for the last few weeks of my cousin's life, they celebrated Christmas once a week. And they had a Christmas and a birthday once a week until that was it. And I was putting myself in his shoes, and I was thinking, I was just thinking that I couldn't watch my daughter wither away, and that if I wanted to be, at least I wanted whatever time I had to be happy as could be anyway, and not, I don't know, not just watch her wither away from chemo that's not doing any good anymore.
We had actually asked the endocrinologist at MD Anderson about Dr. Burzynski, and he told us he was a quack and that there was no evidence that worked. But at that point it was like, well, yours doesn't really work either.
The other thing that I did on the FDA's website, you can look up the date at which any drug was granted FDA approval, and I realized that the oldest drug they wanted to give her had come out in the early 70s. The newest drug that they wanted to give Kelsey came out around 1988, and I realized this isn't the cutting edge of technology. This is they're giving us the same old stuff. I just thought, well, this is ridiculous. It felt to me like they were grasping at straws. I was doing all that research, and Sarah and Susan found the Burzynski clinic. Sarah said, well, I want to take her there. I looked at it like, well, if she's got approximately 9 months to live, then, we come over here and we don't have all the side effects. Well, in 9 months' time, which am I going to be better off doing?
Right.
If the ending result is the same.
Upon the removal of Kelsey's left kidney and left adrenal gland, her diagnosis was confirmed at the University of Texas Medical Branch and again at MD Anderson Cancer Center. Where, a month later, MD Anderson also confirmed that Kelsey's cancer had spread to her lungs. After desperately researching Kelsey's situation, her family decided to decline all chemotherapy treatments offered by MD Anderson and instead enroll Kelsey into one of Dr. Burzynski's clinical trials. By this time, Kelsey's cancer had also spread into her liver. After starting her anti-neoplaston treatment, the tumor in Kelsey's liver was gone by August of 2007. CT scans of her chest revealed 6 tumors in her lungs at the start of treatment. One by one, the tumors in Kelsey's lungs began to go away. Leaving one small spot 4 years later, which was deemed to be inactive and most likely scar tissue. Today, Kelsey Hill is considered to have had a complete response to her anti-neoplaston treatment. Since Dr. Burzynski began treating cancer patients with anti-neoplastons, he has successfully treated virtually every type of cancer, relieving thousands of families from across the world of this dread disease. Yet, unlike other clinical trials which are supported by billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies and are often assisted by large tax-funded research grants from the National Cancer Institute, the United States government currently prohibits any taxpayer money to be granted to Dr. Burzynski's FDA-approved clinical trials.
A single phase 3 trial will cost about $25 million. So how many can you run? Okay, you may run few at best. Nobody's giving you money for that. We have to make money for that. Okay, and it's $25 million. Okay, some other pharmaceutical companies will come with the idea. They go to the National Cancer Institute and they will receive handsome grant, $15 million, whatever. Okay, and they do clinical trials. Nobody's giving me any money. Okay, and I'm working like in the wartime condition, okay? Like working somewhere in the Gaza Strip or West Bank, okay? When the bombs are falling on you, but you still have to treat patients, you still have to do phase 2 clinical trials.
Given the existence of a treatment that is curing cancer at a rate that traditional medicine could only dream of, and doing so without any damaging side effects, most would assume that every penny of our tax dollars allocated for cancer research would be thrown in Dr. Burzynski's direction.
The problem that we face, however, is that a huge financial house has been built on the paradigm of purging the body of cancer cells. Burzynski's discovery means that the foundation, the walls, and the roof of that house need to be replaced. Think about it. You know, you've got thousands of doctors in oncology and in oncology residency programs. You've got the pharmaceutical industry pumping out chemotherapeutic agents every month. There are all kinds of machines that deliver radiation. You got all this stuff in the war on cancer, and it's trillions of dollars. I find it very interesting that we have all these walks for the cure of cancer. You got all the wristbands. You got all the donations. We're going to find a cure this decade. All this money keeps pouring in, and it all goes to the same guys.
The pharmaceutical industry is arguably the most profitable industry on our planet, with its profits being triple that of all of the Fortune 500 companies. Rising profits result in rising stock prices. The only way this industry can sustain this profitable momentum is by continuing to introduce new patented drugs. And since the pharmaceutical industry relies on the FDA as its gatekeeper to introduce these new drugs, it's in their best interest to ensure the FDA remains as compliant as possible. And since the FDA is also an office of the United States government, it's in the government's best interest to preserve one of its most powerful industries. The former editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, Dr. Marcia Angel, has been very outspoken with the idea that it's time to take the Food and Drug Administration back from the drug companies. In 1992, Congress put the fox in the chicken coop. It passed the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which authorizes drug companies to pay user fees to the FDA for each brand-name drug considered for approval. The User Fee Act put the FDA on the payroll of the industry it regulates, and it has drastically changed the way it operates. The part of the agency that reviews new drugs now gets more than half of its money from the pharmaceutical industry. The FDA's coziness with industry is underscored by the composition of its 18 advisory committees, outside experts who help evaluate drugs. Incredibly, many of these advisors work as consultants for drug companies. The FDA behaves as though the pharmaceutical industry is its user, not the public. In 2010, the fee revenue paid by the pharmaceutical industry to the FDA has risen to over $500 million annually. Pharma now pays over $1.4 million per application for most cancer drugs submitted to the FDA to ensure a timely approval. It's important to understand that neither Congress or the FDA had requested this new fee structure to occur. Instead, pharma itself went to Congress and imposed these new fees onto the FDA, in essence, purchasing the FDA's Drug Evaluation Department from both the government and the public. In a 2007 health policy report sponsored by Pfizer, supporting the renewal of these user fees, they revealed that the median review time for priority drugs, those for serious life-threatening diseases that lack satisfactory treatments such as cancer, was sped up from 21 months in 1993 to 6 months in 2004. Dozens of cancer therapies have been reviewed and approved within 3 or 4 months. Meanwhile, Dr. Burzynski, his patients, and other supporting scientists have made every conceivable effort to get the FDA, and thus the government, to cooperate in the research, review, and approval of anti-neoplastons since 1977.
Before I started, I asked the lawyers for the advice. Can I use experimental treatment, which was the treatment with angioplastons? Can I use this in my private practice, and can I be involved in cancer research? Simple as the private company.
Dr. Burzynski's attorneys investigated both state and federal law to find out if it was legal for him to start his own biomedical research company, making antineoplastons and administering them to his patients within his private practice. They found that according to both the Texas state and federal law, the use of any drug or new drug can be used to meet the immediate needs of the patients of a licensed doctor, particularly when there is no other available option for them. The law stated that such activity was not governed at the time by the Texas Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and is not otherwise unlawful under the laws of the state of Texas. However, Dr. Burzynski would not be legally allowed to introduce or deliver antineoplastons into interstate commerce, which means he had to keep his activities only within the state of Texas to avoid breaking any federal laws. As long as he did this, his actions were not within the regulatory authority of the FDA. However, once word began to spread that Dr. Burzynski was successfully treating what was once considered terminal incurable cancer patients, people began traveling from all over the country to receive antineoplaston treatment.
For a long time, I didn't have any contact with Texas Board of Medical Examiners until around 1984. Some of my patients told me that they were approached by the agents sent to them from Texas Board of Medical Examiners, who were trying to convince them to file complaints against me. So this was shocking to me. And what is surprising, that they were using the state money, they were using taxpayers' money to travel a long distance, like from Houston to California, to convince our patients who were in California to file complaints against me. This was completely irrational. But nothing else happened at the time until I met, by coincidence, the vice president of MD Anderson Cancer Center, Dr. Hickey, who informed me that I will have problems this time with Texas Board of Medical Examiners. And obviously the problems began. And I was called to Texas Board of Medical Examiners. They began investigating me. However, there were no complaints from the patients. The patients were happy. We were treating patients who were very advanced, for whom there was no treatment available, and they were getting good results. So apparently there was no justification for such action. This was a very unpleasant investigation. They were trying to convince me again to stop my research, to stop treating patients. After about 2 years of going back and forth and being called to the board, finally they proposed to me that I should present to them a number of cases of patients who benefited from my practice. And they informed me that such medical records will be reviewed by expert oncologist, and if they are satisfied that I am not harming patients, that the patients are benefiting from my activity, then they will leave me in peace. I was very happy with this. I believe that Texas Board will do objective review of our results, and finally they will leave me alone, because we had amazing results in the treatment of very difficult cancer cases. I supplied to them twice as many medical records, which show without any doubt great results in the cancer treatment. Incurable forms of cancer completely disappearing, with patients going to complete remission, and patients who were cured and living normal life after that.
In 1986, Dr. Burzynski agreed to present to the Texas State Board of Medical Examiners 40 cases of various types of cancer he had successfully treated using antineoplastons in patients ranging from breast, bladder, lung, liver, brain, head and neck, and lymphoma. After submitting these cases to the medical board, he didn't hear back from them, leaving him to assume that the board was satisfied and would leave him in peace. However, 2 years later, the board came back again, pretended that the cases he submitted were not successful, and claimed he was violating a law that didn't exist, which was grounds for the board to cancel, revoke, or suspend his license.
It was a shock to me. I believed in justice, I believe in high ethics of the board, but this was just a lie.
The medical board had no case against Burzynski, which prompted the board to file their first amended complaint in 1990, Still, the board had no case, which prompted them to file a second amended complaint in 1992. The medical board kept coming back each time with the same argument, practically making Xerox copies of their prior claims, changing the titles, and simply resubmitting them. After about 5 years of this, 60 of Dr. Burzynski's patients petitioned the board to stop harassing their doctor. The board then tried to ignore these petitions by attempting to strike them from the record. Finally, in May of 1993, this case went to trial.
The tumors will grow, they will lose the vision, they will be paralyzed, and they will die, because there's nothing in the world which can be used to save these patients' life.
You intend to continue doing just what you've been doing until somebody is able to stop you. Is that not true?
I'm going to do what the law will allow me to do, Mr. Helcom. I do whatever is necessary to bring my medicines to approval in the United States and everywhere in the world, and bring you to justice for causing the death of 200 patients. And they will come back here to haunt you until you are dead.
Are you threatening me, Dr. Burzynski?
I'm not threatening you, but that's what's going to happen in the future.
Well, I think that's something that remains to be seen.
I had never heard of Dr. Burzynski. I didn't know anything about him. I never was quite clear what the board's problem was. The board did not bring any expert witnesses to contest points that were raised by Dr. Burzynski. Now, without an expert witness to render an opinion in certain areas, I can't give any credence to opinion raised by a layman. And Dr. Burzynski brought in Dr. Nicholas Petronas.
Some of the most dramatic testimony on Dr. Burzynski's behalf came from Dr. Nicholas Petronas,
Doctor, I want you to see up here.
a Georgetown University expert who was a member of the National Cancer Institute's team that analyzed 7 of Dr. Burzynski's cases.
The basic conclusion was that in 5 of the patients with brain tumors that were fairly large, the tumor resolved, disappeared. It's amazing, the fact that they are living. It's impressive and unbelievable.
He was quite a witness. He said he had never seen anything like what Dr. Burzynski was able to accomplish with his anti-neoplastons in brain cancer. He had one young boy there who had been treated. He was about 12 at the hearing, strapping lad, good-sized boy. But when he was first started on treatment when he was about 4 years old, I think his name was Paul, he was given up on by his original doctor.
When Mary Michaels took the stand on behalf of her son Paul, she trained her eyes on the state's attorney.
I mean, I have enough to worry about when I go to bed at night about my son and my family. I don't need to worry that this treatment's going to be taken away.
What do you think might happen if... Oh, never mind. Never mind. I have no other questions.
For all I know, the kid may still be alive.
The judge ruled in Dr. Burzynski's favor, finding that the medical board did not introduce any evidence at the hearing that anti-neoplastons are not safe and effective, nor did they introduce any competent or substantial evidence at the hearing that anti-neoplastons are not generally recognized by experts qualified by scientific training and experience to evaluate their safety and effectiveness. And as far as the law goes, it does not apply to a licensed physician who manufactures his own medications and solely uses it on his own patients in the state of Texas. Now, most would think that at this point the Texas Medical Board would stop wasting their time, Burzynski's time, terminal cancer patients' time, and the taxpayers' money pursuing a case they knew they couldn't win.
Then they told me after they were going to rewrite my proposal for decision and take adverse action against Dr. Burzynski, and I said I thought that was rather foolish.
Well, think again.
The state of Texas wants Houston doctor Stanislaw Burzynski to stop treating his patients with drugs he produces at his own pharmaceutical plant. The drugs called anti-neoplastons are non-toxic compounds of proteins and amino acids, often lacking in cancer patients. Even though the state of Texas acknowledges that the drugs may be helping some who are terminally ill,
The state says the drugs shouldn't be used. This is the State Board of Medical Examiners, which licenses doctors in Texas. This is the agency challenging Dr. Burzynski in court. One judge has already told the board members that they don't have a case.
All of this nonsense which is going now should disappear, because they should realize that I am right, okay? They're fighting losing battle. I am saving human lives, and if they put me out of business, the people will die.
This is the brain of an 8-year-old boy with a huge tumor most thought would kill him. He used Dr. Burzynski's drug. Images of his skull taken 6 years later show the tumor has almost disappeared.
Dr. Bruce Cohen is the director of neurologic oncology at the prestigious Cleveland Clinic.
The only explanation is that it shrunk because of the therapy Paul has received.
He confirmed Dr. Burzynski's results on Paul.
7 years that we've had Paul, and he's been healthy, and I owe it to this man. And there's no way that I'd ever be able to thank him enough for what he's done for us.
Today, that boy, Paul Michaels, and his anxious family sit in the courtroom with other patients.
Undeterred by the 1993 ruling, the Texas Medical Board took Dr. Burzynski to a higher district court. Of course, this time, they knew they couldn't raise any issues about whether or not his treatment was effective.
The Texas State Board of Medical Examiners, which has fought to suspend Dr. Burzynski's license because his treatments have never been approved, says, quote, the efficacy of anti-neoplastons in the treatment of human cancers is not of issue in these proceedings.
It takes a bureaucrat to come up with that idea, because a layman, that would really be the question.
Well, Dr. Burzynski has won his latest round in court. The medical examiner's order was reversed, but that is not expected to be the end of his trouble with the state of Texas.
The Texas Medical Board took this imaginary case all the way to the Texas State Supreme Court, where the judge issued an erroneous probation order against Burzynski, which Burzynski successfully served, but again, leaving the Texas Medical Board completely unsuccessful in their efforts to remove his medical license. So, if efficacy was not an issue, and Dr. Burzynski wasn't breaking any laws, then why would the Texas Medical Board continue on with this empty pursuit? Well, it was eventually realized, even by the mainstream press, that the Food and Drug Administration had been pressuring the Texas Medical Board to continue trying to take away Dr. Burzynski's medical license.
For this story, we wanted to talk to the FDA about its policies and procedures. The agency did agree to talk to us on background where it wouldn't be quoted, but it repeatedly refused our requests for on-camera interviews.
While they were busy pressuring the Texas State Medical Board to try to revoke Dr. Burzynski's medical license, they were even busier trying to revoke Dr. Burzynski completely from society by trying to place him in prison. The FDA and pharma quickly realized that if Dr. Burzynski's discovery would be given a fair review process, not only would chemotherapy and radiation dwindle into obscurity, financially crippling the industry, but it would also mean that for the first time in history, all of that income would funnel away from pharma and into the lap of one single scientist who holds the exclusive patent rights. Apparently, the FDA had not ruled out the possibility of this happening one day. On March 12, 1976, FDA Bureau of Drugs Director Richard Kraut states in the cancer letter, when anyone other than large institutions ask permission to conduct clinical trials, you want harsh regulations. Sometimes we say it is proper to hinder research. And once these guidelines were adopted, the FDA would consider itself bound by them. In 1982, Kraut states again, I never have and never will approve a new drug to an individual, but only to a large pharmaceutical firm with unlimited finances. And so, the fiercest fight in FDA history began.
Dr. Burzynski's dealings with the FDA commenced in 1983. At that point, the FDA commenced a civil action to try to close the clinic and stop all patients from receiving the medicine.
Before the judge in this case had announced her ruling, the FDA sent her a letter warning her in advance, if this court declines to grant the injunction sought by the government, thus permitting continued manufacture and distribution of anti-neoplastones, the government would then be obliged to pursue other less efficient remedies, such as actions for seizure, also known as raiding his clinic and home, and condemnation of the drugs, also known as a propaganda campaign, or criminal prosecution of individuals, also known as throwing Dr. Burzynski in prison. Regardless of these threats from the FDA,
the judge in the case basically said that he can treat anybody he wants in Texas, but he can't ship his medicine in interstate commerce. The FDA viewed that as a failure and told Dr. Burzynski's at the time, his attorneys at the time, that they have other ways to get him. Let's talk about the other ways. In 1985, the FDA convened a grand jury to hear evidence to try to indict Dr. Burzynski. In connection with that, they had a raid of his clinic where they seized 200,000 pieces of paper, including all of his medical records of all patients. A little difficult to practice medicine when you don't have medical records.
Obviously, they came out and they confiscated all of our medical records. And it took us about 12 years or 14 years to recover these medical records. In the meantime, we are permitted to make copies of the medical records in their office, but it was also the neglect of human well-being. We are treating very sick people. They took medical records, and we needed these medical records to really fight for the lives of these patients, but they took this away. They didn't care for these patients. The patients could die. They were not important.
They presented the evidence to the grand jury, no indictment. 1986, they come back, seize another 100,000 documents, no indictment. 1990, another grand jury, either the second or the third. They present more documents. Dr. Burzynski testifies extensively before the grand jury, no indictment. 1991 to 1993, FDA investigates Dr. Burzynski. We don't know if evidence was presented to another grand jury. 1994, another grand jury, no indictment. 1995, another grand jury. This grand jury started in March of this year. On March 25th, I believe, it was Dr. Burzynski, along with a few of his patients, appeared on CBS show This Morning.
Let me play devil's advocate. Here you all, very desperate folk, had undergone some cancer treatment, correct?
No.
None at all for you?
I had no treatment.
Let me go after these guys then first. Had undergone some treatment. Could it not have been that the treatment that you received prior to Dr. Burzynski's treatment was what, in fact, really cured you?
Well, I'll jump on that. No way, because the recurrence I had was in a brand new spot that had not been involved before. So if all the punishment that I went through for the year went out of my system, and after it went out of my system, all of a sudden a new tumor comes in, how could that first treatment have helped the subsequent tumor?
Later that day, the FDA came another raid, more patient documents, more subpoenas.
We were flooded with calls last Friday with people wanting to know how to get a hold of you. They're going to see this story this morning, see that you've been raided by the FDA, and they're going to want to know if you're for real or if the concerns of the FDA may have something to do with your treatments and the viability of your treatments.
Well, I don't think, let me jump in here. I don't think there's really an issue, as I mentioned, regarding the safety of the drug, and the FDA isn't contending at this point that the drug doesn't work. The only issue is that according to the FDA, it has not been proven by controlled clinical trials. So at least in terms of safety, the FDA isn't saying that it's not safe, and the FDA isn't even saying that it doesn't work. Right now, they're just contesting, or apparently they're contesting, whether Dr. Burzynski himself has been shipping the medicine out of state, which in some respects is quite ridiculous since he has approval to ship the medicine out of state to various cancer institutions around the country. He ships it out of the country to various countries because it's being used in other places, and he ships it to individuals who have been granted permission by the FDA to receive the medicine under what's called a compassionate use INDs.
Okay.
May, June, and July, more witnesses testified before the grand jury, more documents. So we've had now 4, 5, or 6 grand juries. Let me talk about the subpoena practices. Most recently, the FDA has now subpoenaed the medical records of every patient who has gone on TV and told their story about Dr. Burzynski. We'll let the committee judge what they think of that. We talk about dissemination of false information by the FDA. 1985, FDA tells anyone who calls and inquiring about Dr. Burzynski that He's being criminally investigated. When the judge on the case found out about that, he issued a cease and desist and a strong reprimand against that. The FDA now has refined this tactic. Instead of waiting for people to call up the FDA, what they've done is subpoena all the records from Dr. Burzynski about his business associates and all the researchers around the world, and there are many of them who are researching anti-neoplastons, his therapy. Now what they're doing is systematically contacting everyone who does business with him, who may do business with him, and telling about the grand jury investigation and subpoenaing documents. I believe that they're doing this in order to make the FDA, to make it more difficult for him to do business. I'd like the following questions to be asked the FDA. How much money have they spent in the last 10 years to try to put Dr. Burzynski out of business? How many documents can they subpoena, and how many more grand juries does he have to go to? And why can't patients who have advanced cancer seek the medical treatment of their choice?
Upon the commencement of the FDA's 1995 grand jury against Dr. Burzynski, an oversight and investigation subcommittee was organized by Congressman Joe Barton in an attempt to intervene in the FDA's relentless harassment of Dr. Burzynski and his patients.
In my opinion, you have every right to use the investigative authority and the judicial resources of the federal government through the Justice Department to convene a grand jury. That's very appropriate. The first time, perhaps even the second time. It becomes questionable the third time, the fourth time, and the fifth time. It is not, I think, an unlogical conclusion to think that the FDA has a vendetta against Dr. Burzynski or wants to retaliate for some reason. Now, that's my opinion. How many grand jury investigations have to occur that result in no finding of fault before you, as commissioner of the FDA, would encourage those within your organization to cease and desist?
Mr. Chairman, how do you know that there were no findings of fault that were returned from that grand jury?
There have been no indictments returned.
Mr. Chairman, I ask counsel to comment, but I don't think those are the same. As a matter of law, those are the same things.
I'm baffled by the splitting of hairs here, but
I'm just trying to understand the exchange between the witness and the chairman. What I understood the chairman to say is that there have been 4 grand juries convened?
At least 4.
I just am left then with a rather strong inference that if you convene 4 separate grand juries and there's no indictment returned, notwithstanding the prosecutors tell us always that it's possible to indict a ham sandwich, that probably there's not much there.
Dozens of Dr. Burzynski's patients who had traveled to Washington, D.C. from all corners of the United States stood up and expressed their outrage with the FDA and Commissioner David Kessler.
The FDA has made a list and decided who can live and who will die. I guess I didn't make that list.
I've had no chemotherapy. I've had no radiation. I chose Dr. Burzynski instead after a lot of research and a lot of searching. I've been in remission since 1989. Dr. Kessler, I'm not a statistic.
We're frustrated that our rights, constitutional rights, have been violated. This has got to end. My children are asking me, Daddy, what does the future hold? My one daughter wrote a letter to the president of this country and said, please don't pull the plug on my daddy. And that just broke my heart and broke my wife's heart.
My husband is a walking miracle. 16 months ago, the doctors told us there's nothing else they can do, and they told us to enjoy what little life he has left. Look at him. He biked 32 miles after being on Dr. Burzynski's treatment for 2 months, and they're saying we can't have it?
I have a report from my family physician which tells how well I am doing. My tumors are leaving my body, and my condition is improving every day. Now the FDA is saying to me, no, your doctor is a criminal, he should be put in jail, and he needs to be shut down.
This is criminal. I want the FDA to get out of our lives and stay out of her doctor-patient relationship.
What the classical conventional medicine had to do for me was nothing. For me the next thing was the minister. I did not want to undergo chemotherapy, which I had a new name for, chemotherapy, or any type of radiation. I was extremely lucky I found Dr. Burzynski. And I don't want the FDA to take this right from me. I came 18 years ago from communist Romania, and the tyrannous dictator Ceausescu never stopped a doctor from treating anybody. How can we have something like this in the United States?
Barely a week after these hearings, on November 20th, 1995, Dr. Stanislaw Burzynski was indicted. Burzynski was charged with 75 counts of violating federal law and fraud. If convicted, Burzynski would face a maximum of 290 years in a federal prison and $18.5 million in fines. Not to mention what would happen to his patients.
He is their last chance for life, but now the federal government is issuing a death sentence for the patients of this cancer doctor.
On February 9th, Houston federal court judge Sim Lake ruled Dr. Burzynski's treatments have been, quote, illegal under Texas and federal law since 1984, and he ordered them stopped on all but a handful of patients. Then he put a stay on his own order, a stay of execution.
I believe that most of these 300 people will die within a short period of time if the treatment is stopped.
In 1996, not only did scores of Dr. Burzynski's patients return to Washington, D.C. to protest his indictment, but many of them testified again before another congressional hearing headed by Congressman Joe Barton.
Our first witness is Marianne Canary, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
From Aurora, Minnesota. So.
This is Dustin Canary, and he is on Dr. Burzynski's anti-neoplastic treatment. This is my husband, Jack Canary. Now, in February of 1994, our lives were drastically changed. My son, Dustin, was only 2.5 years old at the time. He was diagnosed with a brain tumor the size of a golf ball. The surgeon removed 75% of his tumor, and the remaining 25% was diagnosed from a biopsy as a malignant, very aggressive medulloblastoma brain tumor, one of the most deadly forms of brain cancer. The doctors told us Dustin had only a few months to live. The first treatment offered us was radiation, but the radiation doctor told us that at his young age, Dustin would become a vegetable, and it would only extend his life for maybe a few months. The next doctor wanted us to enroll Dustin in a experimental chemotherapy, which was highly toxic. The side effects would include hearing loss, kidney and liver damage, bladder, stunted growth, and a possible leukemia. One question I would like to ask is, would you do that to your child? We weighed the harm these experimental drugs would cause against the fact that they would not cure Dustin, and decided not to subject him to these drastic measures. But our oncologists told us that their opinion took precedence over us as parents. This put added stress to the already stressful situation we were in. In April of 1994, we visited Dr. Stanislaw Burzynski in Houston. Dr. Burzynski made us no promises, but said that he often had very good results with brain tumors. At worst, it would not hurt Dustin, and it offered the best hope and a longer quality of life. An MRI 6 weeks after we started Dr. Burzynski's treatment revealed no tumor. We were very overjoyed. Dustin continued anti-neoplastin therapy, and 1 year later, a tumor 1 inch by 1 inch in size was found on the MRI. That would be April of 1995. Dr. Burzynski immediately raised Dustin's dose of anti-neoplastins. There were still no harsh side effects at all. The next MRI in September of 1995 revealed that the tumor had almost disappeared again. To this day, it has not reappeared. If you look at Dustin right now, he is a happy, healthy 4-year-old who has outlived his prognosis. There is no traditional treatment that would have kept him alive with such good quality of life. FDA Commissioner David Kessler loves to grab headlines as a man who loves children so much. He wants to protect them from the ravages of smoking. If Dr. Kessler loves children so much, why have he and his agencies been trying so hard to cut off my son's last hope for life? Without this treatment, my son will die.
This is a photo of Dustin Canary at 4 years old in 1996. This is a photo of Dustin Canary at 18 years old in 2009, and his brain cancer never returned.
In 1996, because of pressure from the politicians and American opinion, FDA agreed to accept all of the patients whom we have at the time to the program of phase 2 clinical trials. Basically, we filed and received permission to proceed from FDA for 72 different phase 2 clinical trials, which covered practically any type of cancer. This was such a tremendous work that basically it was necessary for me to work almost around the clock with 6 secretaries who were typing different protocols, and later I learned that FDA created a special task force to be able to review these protocols. You have sarcoma, soft tissue sarcoma, there's a special protocol for that. You have breast cancer, special protocol. For lung cancer, a few different protocols. For brain tumors, about over 20 different protocols for different types of brain tumors.
So, just a year before his trial facing life in prison, the Food and Drug Administration had finally authorized the very thing that Dr. Burzynski and his patients had ever wanted. Even still, the FDA would not back down in making sure Burzynski's trial moved forward. Federal prosecutors concede that a cancer doctor they will put on trial here in January for using an innovative but unapproved drug has been saving lives. The prosecution marks the first time the FDA has tried to jail a scientist for using a drug on which he is conducting FDA-authorized clinical trials. In a pretrial motion, Assistant U.S. Attorney Mike Clark objected to a defense request for the jury to visit the chemical plant where Dr. Burzynski manufactures anti-neoplaston. The jury visit request is a thinly veiled effort to expose the jury to the specter of Dr. Burzynski in his act of saving lives. Whether anti-neoplaston does or does not work is not an issue, and the jury should not be asked to decide the question. He added that if the issue comes up at trial, it would be an irrelevant, emotional, prejudicial, and misleading concern.
The issue of whether anti-neoplastons work may not even come up during the trial. The judge says that's not relevant, but the defense contends that's exactly the point, that what was done in developing the drug and administering it was done to save lives.
This trial cost the American taxpayer $60 million, while costing Dr. Burzynski over $2.2 million. $700,000 of Burzynski's legal defense was raised primarily by Dr. Julian Whitaker through his newsletter, Health and Healing. After Dr. Whitaker wrote of the plight and injustice being done to Dr. Burzynski, his readers sent in close to 18,000 checks and small donations for Burzynski's legal defense.
The trial is expected to last about 2 months. The jury will then decide whether Burzynski is a fraud or a medical pioneer.
On March 4th, 1997, due to a deadlocked jury, the judge declared a mistrial. And after saying the government had not presented sufficient evidence, he ordered that Dr. Burzynski be acquitted of nearly half of the 75 counts.
You voted to acquit?
To acquit, absolutely.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. I voted for acquittal. I voted my mind and my heart.
I do not believe that Dr. Burzynski is a criminal.
And I had voted to acquit.
But the FDA was still not backing down. They took Dr. Burzynski to trial again. Though, after apparently accepting the absurdity of their case, on May 19th, the FDA suddenly dropped 40 of the 41 remaining charges. The FDA's facade in trying to convince the world that Burzynski was a criminal was completely unraveling. Even the jurors who voted not guilty in the first case took time off of work to join the patient's protest in front of the courthouse during the second case.
I am appalled at the Food and Drug Administration and their actions.
We're here today basically to protest the witch hunt that's going on by the FDA.
We have to stick together and really support these patients that are suffering, not only health-wise, but having to come down here to make a stand against the FDA.
Please don't waste my money abusing the system to make sure that you maintain your power.
The jury spent about 3 hours deliberating this house of cards, leaving Burzynski acquitted of the final charge.
Every one of Dr. Burzynski's patients now, every future Burzynski patient is and will be on a clinical trial.
There are many patients who would like to testify in our behalf and convince the jury and the judge that without the treatment they will die. But the judge did not admit any statements which could show that the treatment is effective. The judge did not allow the jury to visit our facility where we produce medicine. They were trying to keep it away from the jury. If this information would be presented to the jurors, then this trial would be finished very quickly. And that's what the jurors told us, because after the trial we talked to the jurors, and they were shocked that such information about the treatment, which is saving the life of a patient, was not presented to them. And I was sick listening to the lies of prosecutors from U.S. attorneys. It was not necessary for them to do it. They could tell the truth. They represented the biggest power, but they still were doing this all the time. So they were trying to do it a sneaky way. And that's what is horrible, okay? That's what should be exposed, because I think the United States deserves better.
While all of this was taking place, Burzynski knew that the easiest way to keep the government from putting him out of business or in prison was to partner with an established pharmaceutical company. An interest was shown from Japanese pharmaceutical company Chugai and the Italian pharmaceutical company Sigma Tau, but both deals eventually evaporated, likely due to the rapport developed so far between anti-neoplastons and the FDA, being an issue indeed, and were unable to verify the likelihood that they could openly and effectively work with the FDA. Then, by 1990, it seemed that Burzynski's luck had finally changed. Burzynski had apparently treated the sister-in-law of the chairman and CEO of Elan Pharmaceuticals. Elan enthusiastically drafted a letter of intent stating they would aggressively pursue the filing of necessary protocols with the Food and Drug Administration for approval and marketing of anti-neoplastons as quickly as possible. They soon negotiated financing, licensing agreements, and royalties. In the midst of closing this deal with Elan, more good news emerged. Dr. Davorit Samid, a scientist and medical professor from Maryland who Burzynski had hired to further study antineoplastons, managed to present her work at an oncology symposium in Switzerland, which landed her and antineoplastons a cover story in a 1990 issue of Oncology News.
In 1989, we retained Dr. Davorit Samid as our consultant. Dr. Samid at that time worked at Uniformed Services Medical School in Baltimore, and later she moved to the National Cancer Institute. She did a lot of work with antineoplaston ingredients. Unfortunately, when the pharmaceutical company entered the picture, such as Elan Pharmaceutical, our consultant, Dr. Samid, became too close. She really became consultant for Elan Pharmaceutical, and she was working with Elan from this time.
And suddenly, Elan Pharmaceuticals terminated their licensing agreement, stating Elan has significant doubt as to whether the active substances comprising of antineoplastons have patent protection, thereby rendering an agreement meaningless.
Antineoplastons are not just one chemical. You have different ingredients in antineoplastons. Okay? One of these ingredients was known, and before we discovered that this is metabolite of antineoplaston, and was known and was available before. Okay, so when we patented our invention, our lawyers told us, look, you can't patent this particular ingredient because it was known before. Okay, so let's list it in your patent, but don't patent this because you never get patent for that. Okay, but this is the least important ingredient of antineoplastons.
While this was an odd turn of events, more good news continued to pour in. It was in October 1991 when Dr. Nicholas Petronas led the National Cancer Institute on their site visit, the very same site visit Dr. Petronas would later base his testimony when defending Burzynski against the Texas Medical Board. This site visit not only confirmed that antineoplastons were curing what was previously considered incurable brain cancer, but it garnered their interest in conducting a confirmatory trial under Division of Cancer Treatment sponsorship at the National Cancer Institute. These trials involved most of their top experts, including Dr. Michael Friedman, the Associate Director of the Cancer Therapy Evaluation Program. In a memo addressed to his director, Dr. Friedman wrote, "I thought you would be interested in this. Antineoplastons deserve a closer look. It turns out that the agents are well-defined, pure chemical entities. The human brain tumor responses are real." The National Cancer Institute's decision network then convened and gave the green light to conduct government-sponsored clinical trials of antineoplastons.
Initially, everybody was very excited about it. Everybody would like to proceed. The people who reviewed our results, the experts from the NCI, they did a very good job. They were critical, of course, but they were also highly complimentary for the way we treat patients and the results we got. Okay, so it looks like everything should open and we move forward. Suddenly, everything came to the stop, and then we found that a few months later, Elan received permission to do clinical trials with this particular ingredient. Okay, ours was pushed back for something like 4 years, and then Elan was allowed to proceed with this one suddenly.
When Elan terminated their business deal with Burzynski, they went behind his back, recruited Dr. Davorit Samid, and partnered with the National Cancer Institute, where Dr. Samid soon became a section chief. Elan then co-sponsored laboratory research and clinical trials testing only this single ingredient, called phenylacetate, the same chemical that Burzynski was advised he couldn't patent, and had already proven to be quite limited against cancer as a single substance as far back as 1980.
After the treatment in a small number of patients, we found that the activity was quite limited. That's why we decided to abandon phenylacetate, and we use the other antineoplastons. One of them contained phenylacetate as the second ingredient. Phenylacetate alone has very small activity. It's not very effective.
In 1994, I started working for Deborah Samid. She didn't let me know that one of those compounds is from Burzynski, Dr. Burzynski. You know, it's just say phenylacetate and show me all the published paper about phenylacetate and its analogs and their anti-cancer activity. It was quite amazing in the lab, because if you find a compound that has anti-cancer activity and then you find a bunch of analogs, it's like you stumbled in a pile of gold. So people would think, hey, say, you know, patents, you know, that sort of thing. Devoted under her leadership, we find a lot of biological activities of these compounds. So it would have anti-cancer activity. So the scientists at Johns Hopkins tried to patent these compounds. But of course, Devoted was working with Iran Pharmaceutical company at that time. So those guys at Johns Hopkins didn't have any chance of patenting those compounds. So, you know, but it's interesting that she would complain in the lab and saying that these guys, you know, it's try to, you know, go behind her back and patent these compounds.
While Burzynski was facing continuous harassment from state and federal agencies, the earliest phenylacetate studies were published in April of '92, authored by Deborah Samid, hosted by the National Cancer Institute. Burzynski sat in awe as he witnessed the National Cancer Institute recruit one of his researchers, push his research aside, and begin to test phenylacetate without him, reporting, "Phenylacetate is both effective in inducing tumor cell maturation and free of cytotoxic and carcinogenic effects, a combination that warrants attention to its potential use in cancer intervention."
1995, you know, in the lab, I was still with Deborah, but I smell fishy. Something is not right. The first paper Deborah published about phenylacetate, if you look at the methodology section, there's the BRI abbreviation. She got materials from Burzynski Research Institute, Houston, Texas, but it didn't say Burzynski Research Institute. For us, as scientists, it's a funny practice.
Burzynski's name failed to appear in the acknowledgments or any of the references listed in this report. Burzynski knew these tests would fail, since he had already proven this in his own laboratory 12 years before. Abandoned by the National Cancer Institute, he sat powerless on the sidelines as the attempted hijacking of his discovery unfolded before his eyes, ending in the hideous train wreck he warned them it would. The National Cancer Institute, Ilan, and Dr. Samid spent over 4 years and tens of millions of dollars testing phenylacetate.
Phenylacetate really by itself has very little clinical effect.
And the NCI or Ilan could not use the other ingredients of angioplastin because they were covered by the patents owned by me. They were trying to commercialize this, but without the other ingredients, they couldn't do much with this. This needed to be given in conjunction with the others.
While coming to terms with this reality, the National Cancer Institute decided to honor the government-sponsored clinical trials of anti-neoplastons they had initially promised Burzynski in 1991. From the moment this dialogue was reopened, the National Cancer Institute proposed altering the treatment protocols that Burzynski had spent 20 years perfecting. Burzynski told them that until they agree to a protocol that he has confidence in, he was not going to provide the National Cancer Institute with any anti-neoplastons. Dr. Michael Friedman told Burzynski, "In response to your correspondence, one last time, we will revise the protocol with regard to dose and schedule in compliance. However, if you are unable or unwilling to provide the anti-neoplastons in the near future, we will pursue alternative sources to procure the drug or its active components, and will proceed." Burzynski responded, I appreciate very much that you have finally decided to follow my recommendation regarding dosage. But your final statements that you are ready to proceed with the treatment with anti-neoplastons without our participation caught me by surprise. It is hard to imagine that a federal employee would consider patent infringement. Placing these ominous threats from Michael Friedman aside, they finally managed to agree on a protocol. The protocol was simple. Patients with tumors larger than 5 centimeters, more than one tumor, or with metastasis are excluded. After everything was approved and Burzynski released his medicine, a full year passes, in which time over 15,000 Americans had been diagnosed with the types of brain cancer this trial was focusing on. Yet, America's National Cancer Institute was somehow having difficulties in accruing patients. So, they used this as an excuse to go behind Burzynski's back again and take it upon themselves to drastically alter the protocols. Dr. Friedman, it has been brought to my attention that the protocol has been amended to accept patients with tumors measuring over 5 centimeters, multiple tumors, or with metastasis. I am outraged that without my knowledge, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, with NCI's permission, changed the protocol. Treatment of patients with these conditions will require a different protocol with a different schedule and different dosages. I hereby request that the amendments be canceled immediately and the original protocol be used as promised. The National Cancer Institute responds, "Sorry, but the amendments have been approved." Burzynski fires back. Let me make perfectly clear that as the discoverer and developer of anti-neoplastons and the individual with nearly 20 years clinical experience using them, it is my professional opinion that the drugs will not produce substantial benefit in such advanced patients. As I have repeatedly informed you, the protocol that we are currently using for such advanced tumors requires doses 3 times greater than that currently being used.
These trials have been conducted at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota and the Sloan Kettering Hospital in New York. Currently, there are only 8 patients enrolled.
I'm very dissatisfied with that because our desire is to achieve the proper enrollment in as quickly a manner as we can in order to really test this hypothesis.
Friedman blamed Burzynski for this slow motion, saying Burzynski restricted admissions to the trials too stringently. To speed things up, admission standards for the trials have been lowered to bring in patients in worse physical condition. This over Dr. Burzynski's strenuous objections.
We got the idea that the main interest is to let this patient die rapidly and make sure that treatment will never work.
Dr. Burzynski has threatened legal action to halt these new admissions, and NCI has suspended recruiting, leaving the trials with just those scientifically unsatisfactory 8 patients. Meanwhile, both the FDA and the Texas Medical Board are still trying to stop Burzynski.
On May 8th of '95, less than 2 weeks before this broadcast, the National Cancer Institute issued an internal memo to all of those involved in the anti-neoplaston trials. For the record, the Clinical Trials Monitoring Service has been instructed not to send any anti-neoplastons clinical trial data to Dr. Burzynski, the Burzynski Research Institute, or anyone inquiring about the anti-neoplastons clinical trials. Any inquiries that may be related to the trials or Dr. Burzynski are to be referred to the Associate Director, Dr. Michael Friedman. Friedman then taunts Burzynski. I must convey my deep pessimism. We are in no way obligated to obtain your consent. Your insistence on dictating the manner in which we conduct or review these clinical trials is both presumptuous and inappropriate. The future of these trials rests entirely with the NCI, since our primary obligation is to the American public. Burzynski responds, "Your letter of June 6 conveys pessimism. My letter conveys outrage. Patients were admitted against admission criteria, their treatment was discontinued, and their lives were jeopardized for frivolous reasons. In spite of your promise, we never received any detailed data on these patients. There must be a reason why you are afraid to provide us with complete copies of medical records." Well, there was a very good reason why Dr. Michael Friedman was afraid to provide Burzynski with complete copies of these patients' medical records.
It took us at least half a year before we forced NCI to release some of this information to us. And then we found that they severely violated protocol. They did not comply at all with the protocol. On the top of that, patients were forced to stop the treatment with antioplastons because of massive fluid retention. And this is something which we don't see with antioplastons. Typical effect of antioplastons is dehydration, which means elimination of the fluids. The patients are losing a lot of fluids to the point that they have to drink a lot of extra fluid. We don't see increased fluid retention. I was curious why this could happen. I knew that the patients were receiving a lot of intravenous fluid, but then we learned that perhaps the fluid which they were receiving were not antineoplastons.
In October of 1995, the National Cancer Institute's Cancer Information Service issued a public statement for anyone inquiring about their clinical trials of antineoplastons. In it, they stated, "Because these studies were closed prior to completion, no conclusions can be made about the effectiveness or toxicity of antineoplastons." To their credit, and according to the scientific standards set by the National Cancer Institute, this was indeed the truth. However, 4 years after these trials were closed, and 2 years after Burzynski defeated the FDA and won his freedom, the National Cancer Institute just couldn't leave well enough alone, and decided to vindictively publish these scientifically invalid antineoplaston trials in the peer-reviewed medical literature. In it, they described how 9 patients were treated, and no patient demonstrated tumor regression. However, whoever was responsible for publishing this report was apparently careless enough to also include the antineoplastons concentrations detected in the blood of the 9 patients during treatment.
We compared this to the data which we have in our studies. We found that they were severely diluting the medicine, and this was why the patient had fluid overload. Antioplaston AS2-1 consists of 2 ingredients, which is called phenylacetate and phenylacetylglutamine, and about 2.7 times lower level of phenylacetate in patients' blood compared to what we see in our patients who receive successful treatment. Phenylacetylglutamine, there is about 36 times lower level in patients' blood compared to what we see in our patients receiving the right dosage of antineoplastons. And the concentrations of phenylacetyl isoglutamine, one of the main ingredients of antineoplaston A10, were close to 170 times lower than what we see in the treatment of patients with antineoplastons. And that's what we found from patients' husbands or patients themselves, okay? That's what they were doing, okay? So this was horrible, okay? This was like a criminal act, okay? They should be prosecuted for that, okay? Because obviously they knew what they were doing, and they knew that these patients have really no chance to respond to any treatment. They are going to die, okay? And that's what happened. After we realized what they do, we decided to force them to stop clinical trials. And since then, obviously, National Cancer Institute hates us, okay? They do whatever they can, obviously, do not cooperate with us anymore.
In the past, when NCI or its assigned entity conducting an alternative cancer therapies, they always altered the protocol and let it fail to discredit the therapy. But this time, the pharmacokinetic data shows that they didn't do it right. And most scientists would not look at it carefully because Papa is telling you something and you don't question him.
Most of us would assume that with any story such as this, surely there's another side to it. Our story is no exception. After the National Cancer Institute intentionally violated all protocols of their own antineoplaston trials, and after all state and federal agencies had failed in their 14-year campaign to remove Burzynski from society, after all of the dust settled, a profound truth began to emerge. It was October 4th, 1991, that America's National Cancer Institute hosted their site visit to Burzynski's clinic and verified for themselves that anti-tumor activity was documented by the use of anti-neoplastons. 17 days later, on October 21st, 1991, the United States of America, as represented by the Department of Health and Human Services, and Dr. Davorit Samid filed a patent for anti-neoplastons AS2-1. They even had the audacity to include Burzynski as a reference. The invention described herein may be manufactured, used, and licensed by or for the government for governmental purposes. At the time, Burzynski had no idea this had happened, but did have his suspicions when they began to openly test phenylacetate without him, and the National Cancer Institute knew it. In an April '93 NCI memo distributed to those involved with Burzynski, they state their concerns. Political issues are a real concern. Congressman Bedell is concerned we are taking the anti-neoplastons away from Burzynski. Burzynski has patent on anti-neoplastons. Since phenylacetic acid, or phenylacetate, may be the active component in anti-neoplastons, our involvement has become an issue. 5 months later, the United States of America and Dr. Davorit Samid file their second extended patent on anti-neoplastons. And guess who else was in it? In March of the following year, America files its most extensive updated anti-neoplaston patent to date, spanning 111 pages. 7 months later, they file a fourth one. June 6, 1995, the United States government has a field day filing their 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th extended patent on anti-neoplastons. The following day, America files its 9th, 10th, and 11th extended anti-neoplaston patent. And a couple of months after the 11th patent was filed, Dr. Michael Friedman leaves his position at the National Cancer Institute and becomes Deputy Commissioner of Operations for the Food and Drug Administration, working directly under Dr. David Kessler. And by November of that year, after a decade of failed grand juries, the United States of America's Food and Drug Administration finally manages to indict Dr. Burzynski. 1 month into America's criminal trial against Burzynski, America's first patent on anti-neoplaston AS2-1 is approved. A month after America fails in their second trial against Burzynski, their second and third anti-neoplaston patents are approved. Over the course of the next 3 years, the United States Patent Office approves all 11 copycat patents on anti-neoplastons AS2-1.
And as we know, all of this was done based on the fact that the United States, which is National Institute of Health, together with Pharmaceutical company, which is Elan Pharmaceuticals, was trying simply to steal my invention. That's what they wanted, okay? It's not that we had successful visit from the National Cancer Institute in which they determined that this treatment works great, and they decided that we should go through phase 2 clinical trials, which will be sponsored by them. No. This gave the idea of some higher-ups at FDA to conspire with pharmaceutical company so that they can steal the invention from me and get it because it was good, okay? So that's the whole story, okay? And they knew that if I be still free, they won't be able to do it. Because they knew that if I would sue them, they would have a chance in court because we have our patents before, okay? So that's why the attempts from them to wipe me out financially, to put me to prison, to attack me from every possible angle, FDA, which is federal government, state government, to be able to steal my invention, okay? That's the real thing from the National Cancer Institute and Elan Pharmaceutical. They failed. We survived and we moved forward.
These patents are full of useful information. Aside from noticing their blatant infringement, compositions and methods for treating and preventing cancer, using the distribution of anti-neoplastons AS2-1's ingredients. They enthusiastically state the neoplastic conditions treatable by this method include neuroblastoma, leukemia, myelodysplasia, acute glioma, prostate cancer, breast cancer, melanoma, lung cancer, medulloblastoma, and lymphoma, to name a few. They also point out how anti-neoplastons can also be used as a cancer preventative. However, the most revealing piece of information found in these patents is where they state current approaches to combat cancer rely primarily on the use of chemicals and radiation, which are themselves carcinogenic and may promote recurrences and the development of metastatic disease. Let's read that one again, shall we? Current approaches to combat cancer rely primarily on the use of chemicals and radiation, which are themselves carcinogenic and may promote recurrences and the development of metastatic disease.
Now, how could the U.S. Patent Office be corrupted to the point that they issue patents on medical therapies that had already been patented and issue them to someone who had nothing to do with their discovery or use? How could that happen? And how could the Patent Office then assign these fraudulent patents to some of the most powerful institutions in American government? And imagine, all of this was being done while these same government agencies were spending millions of taxpayers' dollars trying to put Dr. Burzynski in jail so that he could not fight the criminal theft of his discovery.
They in some time have a creed. It's to separate the medicine from the medicine man. And of course, these higher up at NCI or whatever, they think, hey guys, we have been doing this for years. We know what's going on. So they think, well, we know what's going on with phenylacetate, phenylacetylglutamine. If you can outsmart the medicine man, you can cut a piece of a pie for yourself. That's the name of the game. If you cannot be the first one, if you can the second one and be bigger than the first one, still, why not? That's the mentality. You know, under the capitalist sun, there's nothing sacred. Money talks.
The smearing campaign against us continues from good doctors, from American Medical Association, from American Cancer Society, despite the fact that it should stop a long time ago.
True progress in medicine has always, without exception, been violently resisted by medical authorities who cling to the beliefs of their time. In 1840, Ignaz Semmelweis, an Austrian obstetrician, noted that over 20%, that's 1 out of 5, women giving birth in the hospital died 4 to 6 days later of puerperal fever. These women were then autopsied in the basement of the hospital. And the doctors who performed these autopsies wore no gloves. Can you imagine that? Believe it or not, they then would leave the autopsy room and go straight to the delivery room to assist other births without even washing their hands. Then Dr. Semmelweis's good friend and fellow physician accidentally cut his finger while he was doing an autopsy. In 6 days, this doctor died with the same signs and symptoms of puerperal fever. All of a sudden, Semmelweis knew. He realized that the doctors were transferring the disease from the autopsy room to the delivery room, and he urged his colleagues to simply wash their hands. For this unforgivable sacrilege, he was drummed out of the medical profession, and he died in an insane asylum. Now today, we have the same kind of arrogant commitment to belief. But with cancer treatment, we have $1 trillion business built on those beliefs. So if you think Semmelweis had a problem, just imagine the problem Dr. Burzynski faces. There was no money involved in hand washing versus non-hand washing.
fact that we are permitted to enter phase 3 trials means that the treatment shows already safety and efficacy in phase 2 trials. This means that at this moment we should receive overwhelming support instead of being harassed as we are so far.